Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smolar. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here with the National History Academy. And today we are joined by Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park, and we are going to hear from Park Ranger Luke Dixon today. So Luke, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Great. All right, so you should be able to share your screen, Luke, and whenever you're ready.
All right. Let me get the screen shared here. All right. Present there. All right, here we go. Now, today we're going to talk a little bit about Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park. So many of you have probably heard of Appomattox at one point or another, probably during a high school history class. And a lot of times when we hear the word Appomattox, people's minds tend to go toward names like Robert E. Lee or Ulysses S. Grant. We think of the surrender of Lee's army, which took place at Appomattox Courthouse. But there's a lot of confusion that surrounds this place as well, because a lot of times when you are covering the Civil War in a high school history setting, you may not get a chance to go into a great amount of depth in, each particular site or event. There's a lot of ground to cover. And so there's a lot more to the story of Appomattox Courthouse that is often left out. When you often discuss Appomattox in a classroom setting, you might know that, well, Lee surrenders to Grant on April 9th, 1865, and then that's about it. That's about the end of the story. But there's a lot more to it. And so one of the points of confusion that people often have when they visit Appomattox Courthouse is that, again, they're told their whole lives that the surrender of Lee's army took place at Appomattox Courthouse. And so logically, they would assume that surrender happened in a courthouse building. But the surrender itself didn't actually take place inside the courthouse building. There was nothing of historic significance that actually took place inside the courthouse. The reason for the confusion comes from the name of the town. The town itself was known as Appomattox Courthouse, and the surrender meeting itself occurred in a private home, the home of Wilmer and Virginia McLean. And so it's the McLean house where the surrender meeting happened here in the town of Appomattox Courthouse. At that time, county seats, especially here in Virginia, were denoted by the two words courthouse. And so that's why this was the name of the town. This was the county seat of Appomattox County. So when visitors come to visit Appomattox Courthouse, a lot of times they're expecting to find maybe a building or two, and they're surprised when they discover that there's a whole town for them to explore. So there's a lot to see and do here at Appomattox. And so today we'll talk a little bit about what you can see and do here at Appomattox Courthouse, and we'll talk about the story of why this is an important place in American history and a place that needs to be preserved and remembered today. Now, the story of Appomattox Courthouse really begins about 90 miles east of the park in the cities of Richmond and Petersburg. And so I've got a map here that shows you the Appomattox campaign. Now, the Appomattox campaign began on April 1st, 1865. There's a battle that takes place at a place called Five Forks, which is just to the the southwest of Petersburg. And during that engagement, basically, the Union Army is trying to cut off the last supply line into the city of Petersburg, which was the South Side Railroad. And they managed to secure the railroad on April 1st, and on April 2nd, General Grant and his forces captured the city of Petersburg, and Richmond was evacuated the following day. So there had been basically a 9.5-month siege of those two cities of Richmond and Petersburg leading into April of 1865. And so when those two cities fell, Robert E. Lee, he had to make a decision about what he was going to do next. He decided that he was going to try to concentrate his forces. You can see on the map here, they're spread out well over a 30-mile front between those two cities. And so Lee decides to try to concentrate his army at a place called Amelia Courthouse, which is right there in the middle of the map. You can see a big red line going through the town of Amelia Courthouse there. And so Lee is going to try to take this army and move to the south. He knows he doesn't have quite enough men to challenge Grant directly in front of Richmond and Petersburg. So he's going to need some reinforcements. But fortunately for General Lee, there are Confederate soldiers not too far away. General Joe Johnston's army is operating down in North Carolina, not too far away from Raleigh. And so Lee thinks maybe he could link up with General Johnston, slip away from Grant, defeat General Sherman down there in North Carolina, and then bring the Confederate troops back into Virginia to deal with Grant. It was a little bit of a long shot, but that's the best that the Confederates could hope for at that point in 1865. So Lee concentrates his army at Amelia Courthouse, and they are ready to go. But General Grant has got some plans of his own. Grant is not content to sit back in Richmond and Petersburg, just resting on the laurels of the victory that he just won. He knows that his objective is to destroy Robert E. Lee's army. And so Grant sets out in pursuit of Lee with about 80,000 men. Now, keep in mind that Lee departed Richmond and Petersburg with between 50 and 60,000 men. And when General Lee starts moving his army south along the Richmond and Danville Railroad, you can see on the map there that there's a blue line that goes through the town of Jetersville. It's a small little town there, and there were Union troops that got there first. And so Lee, at that point, he didn't want to wreck his army in a frontal assault against a prepared Union position, so he retreats. And he starts to march farther to the west, closer and closer to where we are at Appomattox Courthouse. You can see on the far left end of the map there. Now, there's going to be a major battle fought on April 6th at Sailor's Creek. And today you can visit Sailor's Creek. It is a state battlefield park, Virginia State Battlefield Park. And if you go there, you can read a little bit and learn a little bit more about the engagements that took place. But that is the largest battle of the Appomattox campaign. And it is a significant victory for the Union forces. There's about close to 9,000 Confederate troops, excuse me, close to 8,000 Confederate troops that are captured at Sailor's Creek. One of them is Lee's son, Custis. And so it's a pretty disastrous battle. Lee, after the engagement, will take his army north of the Appomattox River to try to put a physical barrier between himself and General Grant. And in doing so, though, he's going to leave General Grant's army about an 8-mile shorter march to their next stop on the line, which was Appomattox Station. You can see on the far left side of the map there, Appomattox Station marked on the map, the little explosion marker there denoting that there was an engagement that took place there. Now, the reason that Lee needs to get to Appomattox Station is because his army is in need of food. They had resupplied at Amelia Courthouse, but there were no rations waiting for them there. Somehow or another, there was a mix-up in the communication, and there were no rations waiting for the Confederates at Amelia Courthouse. So the rations had been sent further along the line toward Farmville, but there wasn't enough time for the Confederate troops to resupply there. And so those trains were then sent to Appomattox Station. There's a little railroad depot about 3 miles to the southwest of the village of Appomattox Courthouse. So that is Lee's next stop on his route. Again, he's still trying to go south. So Union troops are going to pursue Lee. They're coming behind him. And they're also going to take that route that you see to the south, where you'll see the names of General Ord and General Sheridan riding and marching there to the south of Lee's line of march.
Luke,
Now,
I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. We can't see the map.
Oh, you can't see the map? Okay. What screen do you see right now?
Still on the first title slide.
All right.
Picture of the village.
Let me see. Has that changed it there?
No. Oh, there it is.
Okay. Do you see it there?
Perfect. Yes.
Now all right. Do you see the map now?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay. All right. And do you see the next slide there? Do you see the McLean House?
Right now it's still the map.
Okay. I got you. Okay. All right. All right. So now you can see the map there.
Yes. Okay.
Very good. Sorry about that. My apologies. Okay. So yes, this will make a little more sense now that you can see the map. Sorry about that. But again, so you can see Richmond and Petersburg there on the far right side of the map. You can see Sailor's Creek, which we were talking about, in the middle of the map there. And then the far left-hand side of the map, Appomattox Courthouse and Appomattox Station. So hopefully you're able to kind of follow along there. Again, Lee's army is marching toward Appomattox Station. And so Lee's troops, they get in the area of Appomattox Courthouse beginning around April 8th. There's some Confederate artillery that are in the head of the column, and they're making their way toward Appomattox Station. And they run into some Union cavalry down there at the station, commanded by a person whose name you might be familiar with, and that is George Armstrong Custer. General Custer is commanding a division of Union cavalry, and they capture the Confederate supply trains at Appomattox Station. And they succeed in winning the Battle of Appomattox Station. Those Confederate artillery that had been in the front of the column, they weren't too happy about those Union cavalry taking their food down at the station. So there was a battle fought down there. But Custer is going to win that engagement, capture about 1,000 Confederate prisoners, 24 pieces of artillery. And that night, General Lee is going to have a tough decision to make, because he knows that he has Union troops coming behind him from the east, which you can see on the far left side of the map there. There's a black dot that denotes New Hope Church. And you can see it says Confederate entrenchments there. So there's Union troops coming behind the Confederates. And there's also Union troops down to the south. Lee knows of this as well. To the north, off of the map, is the James River. And there's really nothing left to Lee to the north. He really needs to go south to reconnect with his rations, his supplies, and his reinforcements. So the last way open to the Confederates was to the west. And on the night of April 8th, Lee could hear the sound of the cannon fire and the gunfire down at Appomattox Station, which meant there were Union troops to his west. Now, Lee didn't know how many men were in front of him. And so in a council of war that night, Lee decides to dispatch about 9,000 Confederate troops to reopen the road the following day. They come across the Appomattox River and they try to break through the Union lines. And so on the morning of April 9th, same day of the surrender, there is a battle fought here at Appomattox Courthouse. That's another thing that a lot of times visitors are surprised by. They know of the surrender that takes place here at Appomattox Courthouse, but are surprised that there was actually fighting that happened here. The beginning of the battle goes pretty well for the Confederates. They start to push back the Union cavalry that were blocking the Confederate escape to the west. But no sooner had those cavalry been pushed off the road than about 25,000 Federal infantry arrived on the battlefield. About 12,000 men of the 5th Corps were coming up from the south of the village, and another 13,000 men of the Army of the James were squarely across Lee's line of escape to the west. About 5,000 of those soldiers to the west of the town were United States colored troops. And these are black soldiers fighting for the United States Army. And they had made a march of roughly 30 miles in a single day to get to that spot. So they make a very impressive march to help cut off Lee's escape. So Lee now has to take stock of the situation again. Now he's got sizable Union forces coming at him from 3 directions, from the east, the south, and the west. The north is the James River. And so he is trapped. So it's at that point when Lee decides that he's going to have to surrender. He sends out flags of truce and he requests a meeting with General Grant. And so Grant, he's going to write back to Lee, tells Lee that he's making his way to the front, and he allows Lee to choose the place where the meeting would occur. So Lee dispatches a staff officer into the village named Charles Marshall, and it's his job to find a place for this meeting. Now, the courthouse building was locked. It was Palm Sunday on the day that the armies were here. And the guy with the keys, he's nowhere to be found. So Marshall is just looking for the first property owner he could find that would be able to open up a building for him. And the first person that he happened to see was a man by the name of Wilmer McLean. Now, Wilmer McLean was resident in the village. He was a fairly wealthy man. And he made a good deal of his money during the war by selling sugar to the Confederacy. The McLean family had lived up in Manassas at the start of the war, but had moved down to Appomattox Courthouse in 1863. A lot of times when you hear the story of the McLeans, you hear that they were, war refugees trying to get away from the war because their home was very close to where some of the first major land engagements took place in 1861 at First Manassas. Now, that is part of the McLean story, but one of the other motivations for moving to Appomattox Courthouse was Mr. McLean's sugar business and selling this sugar to the Confederacy. So that's what had brought him down here. But Mr. McLean is going to be approached by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall, and Marshall asks him if there is a building that the generals can use for this meeting. Now, initially, McLean offers a different house, a different structure. We don't know for sure which building it was, but for one reason or another, Marshall says that it was not suitable for the occasion. And so it was only after Marshall rejected that first building when McLean said, well, I can show you inside my house. And so the house looked like this. So hopefully you all can see that there. And that is the building where the surrender meeting actually occurred between Lee and Grant on April 9th, 1865. Now, the meeting itself lasted about an hour and a half in there. And General Grant proposed some pretty generous terms to the Confederate troops. These guys were permitted to return to their homes. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms, their pistols, and their swords because those were privately owned. And the soldiers that had horses, again, they could keep them. Now, the Confederate troops did have to agree to surrender their public property. So things like rifles, cannons, ammunition, things like that had to be surrendered. And they had to agree not to take up arms again against the United States. That's basically the extent of the terms of surrender. There's an exchange of letters that takes place there. Grant will sign the terms of surrender, and Lee will sign a letter accepting the terms. And when those documents are exchanged, it set off a 3-day process where the Confederate troops surrendered their weapons, and they were issued with parole passes that were printed in the Clover Hill Tavern, which here's a picture of the Clover Hill Tavern. These photographs were taken a few months after the surrender, late in the summer, maybe early fall of 1865. So it gives you a good idea for what these buildings looked like at the time that the armies were here. Now, the Tavern is a structure that's right here in the village. You can visit it today. And the Union Army printed close to 30,000 parole passes in that building in just over a day. Now, once those Confederate troops surrendered their weapons here at Appomattox, they were free to begin on their way home. Now, the reason they need these parole passes are because, oftentimes when we think of the surrender at Appomattox, we think of the end of the Civil War. But what happens here at Appomattox Courthouse is only the surrender of a single Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia. There were still over 150,000 Confederate troops in the field after Lee's surrender here. And so the war, technically, it did not come to an end at this point. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, he is still urging the Confederate armies to continue fighting. Now, these soldiers that are being paroled here at Appomattox Courthouse, they're going to be walking back home into a war zone. And so these passes ensure that they can get through Union and Confederate lines safely. It also ensures that they can get transportation on board federal military railroads and steamships, and they can get rations from Union military installations that they encountered on their way as well. Now, if you think of a line of dominoes that are set up and you knock that first one over, it starts a chain reaction, right? And so Lee's surrender is going to start off a chain reaction of surrenders. One by one, these other Confederate armies begin to surrender very quickly after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And so by late June of 1865, the last Confederate ground forces had surrendered. And once again, the nation was at peace. So although the war didn't come to an end right there at Appomattox Courthouse at the drop of a hat, this was the first domino that really started that chain reaction. This is what got the ball rolling and very quickly brought about peace. Now, the last event that took place here at Appomattox Courthouse related to the armies is going to be the stacking of arms ceremony. And that took place on April 12th of 1865. So this is 3 days after the surrender meeting. On that day, there were close to 22,000 Confederate infantry that marched up the Richmond-Lynchburg Stage Road, which is the road that cuts right through the village. And they come up through the town one division at a time. There's 5,000 Union infantry that are lining both sides of the road to receive them. And when the Confederate troops reached the McLean house, that is where the line stopped, they were ordered to halt. They faced to the front and they stacked their arms. The soldiers would unsling their cartridge boxes, place those on the racks of muskets. Units that still had their battle flags, many of them would throw them up and place those on the musket racks as well. And for these soldiers, this was the end of the line. This was an emotional scene for sure. Now, again, as these Confederate soldiers begin making their way back home, they're going to be wondering what happens next, right? And a lot of times when you're doing a kind of a survey of the Civil War or American history, it kind of seems like the events just sort of fall into place. The Civil War will come to a close. The nation moves into this era of Reconstruction, but Reconstruction is a very difficult time for the United States. And so at Athematics, the era of Reconstruction is something that we talk about a little bit as well. So we're both, a part that discusses the Civil War and the events that take place here leading up to the surrender and immediately following the surrender. But we also talk about what happens next and why does it all matter. So when you come to visit Appomattox today, there are a lot of things that are here for you to see. You can see a couple of the modern day pictures of some of the buildings we've looked at. The one in the center there is the McLean House. The one on the right-hand side is the Clover Hill Tavern, where the Union Army printed those parole passes. And the building on the left-hand side is the reconstruction of the Appomattox Courthouse. Now, the courthouse building itself burned down in 1892, and that was rebuilt in 1964 to serve as the park's visitor center. So when you come to the park today, that's a great place to start your visit. We've got exhibits that you can look through in there. There's a 15-minute film that you can watch that gives you a good overview. So there's a lot to see in that building as well. The park today, we encompass over 1,800 acres of land. We have dozens of historic structures that you can see. There's a 5-stop driving tour and 9 miles of hiking trails that you can explore while you're here. So there is a lot to see at Appomattox. Oftentimes, our visitors are surprised when they come to visit by how much there is to see and do. Now, we've talked primarily about the Civil War events here at Appomattox today, and particularly centered around General Lee and General Grant. And a lot of times that is what most of our visitors are familiar with. But there is a lot more to the story and a lot more that you can discover when you come and visit the park today. This slide is going to show a couple of other buildings related to some other stories of some of the individuals that called Appomattox Courthouse their home. Not only did we talk about Lee and Grant, soldiers, both Union and Confederate, but we talk about the civilians, the people that lived here in this town, both free and enslaved. At the time of the Civil War, a little over half of the population of Appomattox Courthouse was enslaved. And for the enslaved people that were living here, April 9th, 1865 was Freedom Day. This was the first time that federal troops had marched through this part of Virginia. The picture that is in the top left there shows the enslaved quarters and the summer kitchen, which have been reconstructed behind the McLean house. The McLean family had 21 enslaved people, 9 of them that were actually living here on their property at Appomattox Courthouse. And for them, again, this is, this moment between Lee and Grant is going to hold a different significance. It's going to mean something different to them than it does to the other citizens of the town, to the Union soldiers, the Confederate soldiers. There are different perspectives. And that's one of the things that we like to talk about here at Appomattox is that what happened here meant something different to each individual, and it depended on their perspective. And so we try to show some of the different walks of life that these people are coming from and how they reacted and perceived these events. So for the enslaved people, again, this is an important moment. The photograph on the bottom right is a picture of what's called the Kelly Robinson House. And that's another interesting story to look at because the Kelly family, which lived in the house during the Civil War, the widow Kelly who lived there had 4 sons that went off and fought for the Confederate Army. Several of them died during the war. And so they have obviously a deep connection to what happened here at Appomattox Courthouse. One of the sons actually surrenders in his hometown. He's got a short walk home after the surrender. But the house is interesting also for the family that lives in it after the Civil War. So after the war, there's a gentleman by the name of John Robinson who will move into the house with his wife and his family. John Robinson was an enslaved man. And when he was enslaved, he was trained as a cobbler and a shoemaker. So he made shoes. And in the post-war years, he bought that house and operated his own shoemaking business out of the home there. So it's kind of a fascinating capsule to look at 2 different families that lived in the same structure at different times and how their lives are both touched by this war, but in very different ways. And so it's kind of a great example of just some of the different stories of the individuals and different perspectives that they had on the events at Appomattox. The Meeks General Store is the building that's in the bottom left-hand corner of the 4 photographs that you see there. Now, the Meeks family that owned the store, their son Lafayette had enlisted in the Confederate cavalry in 1861. There was a company formed right here in Appomattox Courthouse. Lafayette died of typhoid fever in October of 1861, so just a few months after he had enlisted. He is one of the first residents of the village to die as a result of the war. And so his body was brought back to the town, and he's buried here today. And so for the Meeks family, a family that lost a son in this war, the events at Appomattox are going to definitely leave a little bit of a different taste than it did for John Robinson and some of the enslaved people living here. And so again, this is obviously a time period that is very complicated, right? And you have a lot of different perspectives. And so if you come to Appomattox today, we'd encourage you to go on some of our programs we have. The top right corner photograph there shows a picture of one of our rangers giving ranger talk. If you come in either the spring, the summer, or the fall, a lot of times we have ranger programs that you can go on and learn a little bit more about some of these individuals and also about the surrender events and what led up to them. We also have living history programs as well. Individuals who will portray people who were here in 1865, and they do first-person living history here. So they will talk to you as if it's 1865. We have people that portray Union soldiers, former Confederate soldiers, and residents of the village. So definitely would encourage you to come out and explore and check out some of those programs as well. What happened here at Appomattox Courthouse, it did not resolve all of the issues that tore the nation apart in 1861. But what did happen here was a turning point in American history, right? The people of the United States had to decide what they wanted to do with their nation in the future. Would the nation live up to the founding ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal? That question remained after the war: how equal did we want this nation to be? And so again, the events at Appomattox Courthouse don't settle that question. But up to that point, April 9th, 1865, the people of the United States have been trying to settle their differences out on battlefields, firing rifles and cannons at one another. And it had cost more than 700,000 American lives. But after Lee's surrender and the surrenders of the rest of the Confederate armies, there was a transition that took place. A transition from the nation being in a state of war to then being in a state of peace. And although there was much left to be decided in the post-war years, there could be no further progress until there was peace. And so that's why we come to remember this place today. We'd encourage you all to come visit, explore the grounds for yourself. There's something different about walking a historic site, walking in the footsteps of people who were here, and thinking about what it must have been like, trying to put yourself in the shoes of Lee and Grant, or of some of the enslaved people that worked for the McLean families, or say you're the Meeks family that had lost a son to this war. And thinking about some of those different perspectives. When you're walking the grounds here at Appomattox Courthouse, I think it's something that you can't replicate just in reading a book or watching something on TV. And so we certainly encourage you all to come out and visit. So this time, I think we'll open it up for some questions.
Yeah, that'd be great. We are going to be joined now by two of our interns here at National History Academy, Ben and Anjali. If you guys want to share some of the questions here with Luke.
Yeah, great presentation, Luke. And definitely look forward to seeing that in person. Let's start here. I think our first question will be sort of something you touched on, that there's many different stories to expand upon at Appomattox, and not just the surrender, not just two men. How has the site dealt with the growing political nature of even talking about these histories, especially when it comes to enslavement, the Civil War, all those things? It's very, as the country's politically divided, that history has become politically divided. And has that changed how you guys talk about topics? Has that changed your interactions with visitors?
Absolutely, yeah, that's an outstanding question. And so I think that Appomattox is an outstanding place for conversations related to historical memory of how we perceive the Civil War. And, we certainly try to present perspectives from all different sides, right? And so a lot of times, so often in our political discourse today and public discourse, you have people kind of talking past each other, right? And a lot of times the person that shouts the loudest wins. And sometimes it's best to try to step back and take a look at what each side is really saying. And this is a place for conversations to be had. When it comes to the park today, you can have people from two very different perspectives, right? That come and, perhaps you have someone that, maybe had an ancestor that fought in the Civil War. We have people all the time that will come and they will visit, and they had an ancestor that was in Lee's army during the surrender. And so, this place has, it's obviously a significant meaning for them. But we, at the same time, you have people that have descendants that fought for the North, right? Or you have descendants of people who were enslaved that would come and visit the park as well. And so this place is a meaningful one for all of them, and it's a place where people can come together again from different perspectives, but can recognize that this is a historic point. And Appomattox, again, like we talked about, it didn't solve everything. There was much left that was unresolved, but it was a place of healing. And a point where the process of unification began. Again, it's a beginning point. And so just as it was a beginning point, a place of healing in the past, I think it's a great place for a place of healing and reconciliation today here in the 21st century. And do we have any other questions?
The second question is, what was the process like to collect the stories of the people who lived there? How is that done? How are they preserved? And also going on to that, is that available for the public to see?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the stories of the people who are here, again, it kind of depends on which person you're talking about. So with regards to the soldiers that are here, a lot of times, something that's very popular in the 19th century was that soldiers would keep diaries and they would journal about their experiences. And so a lot of those have survived to the present. So we have many diaries, letters that were written by soldiers who were present here. And so you can read, some of their firsthand accounts of what they witnessed. Most of those, a lot of those records that we have are in we have a library here at the park today. And so members of the public are, welcome to contact the park. You can talk with our park historian. If you're doing research for a project or things like that, those are accessible in that way. A lot of stuff is digitized today as well. And one of the great sources, if you're studying the American Civil War, is something called the Official Records of the War of the Rebellion. And so it was a huge, there were dozens of volumes that were published by the federal government after the Civil War. And it includes a great deal of correspondence between the officers, both Union and Confederate officers. And so a lot of that is published. All of that is digitized today. It's free to access online. And if you look in the volume where that deals specifically with the Appomattox campaign, you can read about what these officers and generals are writing back and forth to each other. And that's kind of an interesting thing as well. As far as residents of the village, again, like the soldiers, sometimes, you could find diaries and letters that were written by some of the individuals here. And those documents are held, in different places. We have some here at the park, but they're scattered as well. A lot of that information, though, has been, formulated into a book. There's one book by William Marvel called A Place Called Appomattox that talks a little bit about the residents here in the village. There's a number of books that have been published on the Appomattox campaign, the surrender that takes place here. So there's a wealth of information that can be gained through published materials. When it comes to tracking down the stories of enslaved individuals, that can be sometimes a very difficult process. In particular here at Appomattox, because the courthouse burned in 1892, and when that happened, most of the county's records were destroyed. So that makes it very difficult when you're tracking some of these individuals, because a lot of those records that would be used to kind of track down their stories were lost, unfortunately. But we have been able to gain some information, from ancestors that have, gotten in contact with the park, and they've either passed down oral history. Sometimes they have some documents that they've been able to share with us as well. People like in the case of John Robinson, and things like that. So it kind of depends on the person, right? But whether you're looking at, you can look at census records, or you can look at affidavits and pensions that soldiers file after the war for stories as well. So a lot of different avenues for research, for sure.
Yeah, and you touched there on something that was another one of our questions, which is, what is it like to try and start researching about some small dozens of people that weren't even considered people at the time? That is we know from other sites that we visit with in person and virtually, that is quite the tall task. And for places with a lot more documentation or attention for the last 200 years than Appomattox Courthouse has had the privilege of having. So where do you even begin with that, or what's the progress like on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's something that's still ongoing. We have a researcher currently that is working at the park, basically, full-time, working on compiling specifically African-American history related to Appomattox Courthouse, because there's a lot that we still don't know. Like I said, census records are important in that. That can document where people were living in 1860, and then you can look again where they're living in 1870. You can see the size of their families, names are listed in there, so you can get an idea of who is living here. If there are, again, some oral histories that are passed down from ancestors. The park does have contact with some of the some of the descendants, rather, of some of the African-American community that was here at the time of the surrender. So oral histories are important there. And also, records of their owners as well. Sometimes you may be able to find, records of purchase, when and where some of these enslaved people were purchased. You can, especially ones that were purchased not in Appomattox Courthouse, because again, most of those records were destroyed. But if they were purchased in another town or another city, there's a good chance that you could still be able to find those records. And so you can kind of track where some of those individuals went in that way as well. So a lot of those stories lie beyond, the park library. You've got to go out and do research in a lot of times other cities, other towns, reaching out to other historians. And some of it, especially when you get down to specific individuals that you're trying to look at, can even come down to, just genealogy, right? And trying to track down either from an individual that we know was here in 1865, or if there are descendants living today that we know of, that they can track back their family history to people that were living here at the time. That's another way that we can learn some of their stories as well. But it's a challenge for sure. All right.
Thanks for that. I think we're Angela, you have another one, right?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna go to one other question real fast. So I've read that people have taken items from the house after the surrender. Is that true? Are there still pieces in the house to this day? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are original pieces still in the house today. The house itself, one of the things I didn't have a chance to mention in the presentation, the house itself, the McLean house, is a reconstruction. And that has a little bit of an interesting story to it as well, because the original house was actually dismantled in 1893 by a company that wanted to move the materials up to Washington, D.C. and rebuild it there so that more people could see it. Unfortunately for the company, there was a financial panic in 1893. And when the stock market crashed, bankrupted the main stakeholder in the company. And so the materials, most of them ended up not actually leaving the site. They just sit there in the yard for about 47 years. And a lot of them will unfortunately be either taken as souvenirs by people driving by, or they'll just rot away. Now, the Park Service acquired the site in 1940. They rebuilt the McLean House in 1948 based off of the 93 plans and the photographs that we have. And so the house sits on top of the original foundation. That is still intact. So when you go to the house today, you can still see the original foundation. And there were 5,500 bricks that survived as well. Those were incorporated into the front wall of the home. So you can see some of the original materials of the house. But when you go inside the parlor room, there's also the original vases that were on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. There's a sofa that's an original. And we have a number of other original items in the bedroom of the McLean family's home, the master bedroom. And a lot of the smaller items have come back to us over the years, and we have those in the visitor center today. The large items, for the most part, are in the Smithsonian. So things like Grant's desk, the chairs, there's a bookcase that's in the Smithsonian. Lee's desk that he used during the meeting is in the Chicago History Museum today. So the items are scattered. And it's because of, like you mentioned, the items were taken from the parlor after the surrender meeting. Right after the meeting, the guys that are there, they recognize that this is a historic moment. And so they want a piece of history. They take it with them. And so right after the meeting, those items got scattered. But over the years, most of those pieces found their way into museums, or like I said, some of them did come back to us here at the park. So again, we do have some of the original materials and pieces of furniture today, but not all of them. Some of them are still scattered at other sites. Yeah, great question.
All right, so even more great info. Well, we always like to sort of end our Q&A sessions with asking you, as our great guide for today, how you got to where you are, how you got to be working and doing the job and the great work that you are. And maybe if you have any advice for young history lovers or anyone that might be interested in a similar career path.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up about a 40-minute drive from Gettysburg National Military Park in Pennsylvania. And so I grew up going there all the time as a kid, and I just fell in love with history. And so I knew it was something that I wanted to kind of weave into my career. I didn't quite know exactly what I wanted to do with it, but I decided that I wanted to major in history. And when you choose to major in history, a lot of times the first question that people ask you is, well, do you want to teach? And certainly we need great teachers, right? History teachers are vitally important for passing on the story of not only American history, but of world history. But that wasn't the aspect that I felt most called to. And for me, I've always enjoyed going to historic sites, going to museums, looking at the places where historic events occurred, or looking at the objects that people used. And so I wanted to go into something that's known as public history. That was really where I found my passion was. And so I decided to do an internship with my local historical society after my freshman year of college. And after that, went back for the next summer as a paid tour guide there at the museum. And then later on, as I was taking public history classes in school, I went to Liberty University here in Lynchburg, which is just down the road. I ended up getting a couple of internships at National Park Service sites. I started out working at the National Mall and Memorial Parks in Washington, D.C. And then in 2018, in the summer, I did an internship at Gettysburg National Military Park. And so those internships really set me up. They gave me the experience that I needed, both to see if this was something I really liked and wanted to continue with. And they also kind of opened a door for me to come and work here at Appomattox Courthouse. And so I started out working as a seasonal park ranger. So right now I am what's called a term park ranger. So it's still it's like a 1-year temporary position, but a lot of times in the National Park Service, you have to build up experience in temporary positions before you can get permanent status. And so that's kind of the path that I'm on right now, building up some of that experience with some temporary positions. And so what I would do is, after I graduated with my bachelor's degree in history, I worked at the park in the summertime, and then I pursued my master's degree during the school year. So that's what I've been doing the last few years is getting my master's degree from Liberty as well. So that's kind of what brought me to this point. And I would say, you know, based on my experiences, you know, those internships are definitely valuable. So, you know, if you have, I mean, doesn't matter where you're from, pretty much every you know, county in the United States is going to have some sort of a historical society, or maybe a historic home, or some sort of history related site that you can go and you can ask and see if they, you know, would like to have an intern, or maybe a volunteer. Maybe you just volunteer on the weekends or something like that. Here at Appomattox, we partner with the local high school, and we have several high school students that work here at the park in the summertime. And so it's a program that they'll participate in during the school year with some trainings and things like that. And if they do well during that training session, they can earn a position to work at the park in the summer. And so there's a lot of sites that do similar things where they'll have high school and college interns. And that definitely gives you some experience. And again, it gives you a chance to kind of get your feet wet and see if public history is really something that you would enjoy. So I would say take advantage of the internships. You know, obviously take classes if you can related to public history, if that's something that you're interested in. Most major universities are going to have public history classes that you can take today, and that's going to set you up well for a career in public history.
That's great. Thank you, Luke, so much for sharing. And thank you for joining us today and giving us this wonderful presentation. We truly appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's been great jumping on with y'all.
Great. And thank you everyone at home for tuning in. We'll be back here next week as we continue our virtual tour through different sites in American history. So enjoy the rest of your day.